The Federalist. We're going to be talking about the presidency tonight. I don't know how many more sessions we're going to have with the Federalist because they're grouped together from here on out. From like you have several of them that have to do with the presidency, several of them that have to do with the Senate, and then with the House. So once we get through this, I can kind of get an idea of where we need to go from there. So tonight we're going to be talking about the Federalist, which has to do with starts with Federalist 68. And here's how it reads. Let's start in the second paragraph. It was desirable that the sense of the people should operate in the choice of the person to whom so important a trust was to be confided. This end will be answered by committing the right of making it not to any pre-established body, but to men chosen by the people for the special purpose and at the particular conjuncture. It was equally desirable that the immediate election should be made by men most capable of analyzing the qualities adapted to the station and acting under circumstances favorable to deliberation and to a judicious combination of all the reasons and inducements which were proper to govern their choice. A small number of persons selected by their fellow citizens from the general mass will be most likely to possess the information and discernment requisite to so complicated an investigation. It was also peculiarly desirable to afford as little opportunity as possible to tumult and disorder. And one of the things that comes up a lot in the Federalists is tumult and disorder, trying to keep that from occurring, trying to keep things from falling into disorder. If you study world history much, you know that kingdoms rise and kingdoms fall, and kingdoms rise and kingdoms fall, and they go through different stages and so on. And I'm hoping ours is not in the final stages now, but some of the stuff that's going on, you wonder at times. So I'm going to read a quote here about this that help get us in the right frame here. And one reason I wanted to cover this in particular is because next year we have a presidential election as well as House Representatives, and we'll have a senator. Let's see, if we have a senator up this time? I'm trying to remember. It's this time or in 2 years. So either way, we have an elections coming up, and we have a presidential election coming up, and we look at the different people that are in position now to maybe be candidates for then, which means absolutely nothing between now and then because a lot can happen. Anyway, so with this, he says, it was believed that electing the president directly without the intermediate step of the electors might lead to instability. Hamilton argues that electors will be protected from bias since they do not hold any other political office and are separated from electors from other states. Hamilton believed that this system would best ensure that the president was a man of great virtue and ability, and that's been doubted so many times. What was Hamilton defending in these opening remarks? What was he defending? What do you think he was talking about? He's talking about the Electoral College. He's talking about the way, and I put it down, how do we choose our president? How do we choose our president? The Electoral College. But we get to vote. We get to vote for the president, and then there's electors that are elected that go to represent us. And it goes to how many House representatives you have, and the 2 senators added together is how many electors your state has. So that the electors are chosen, but an elector cannot be in the House of Representatives or in the Senate or an employee of the government in any way. So they have to be as independent as possible. Why was that a good way of doing it? And there's people that argue today, and I have thought along these lines at times, that the Electoral College is outdated because of the communication that we have now and the means of communication that we have. But is the Electoral College outmoded? Is it something that we should do away with? Should we go to a direct popular vote? Or should we keep the electors? And so Hamilton is expressing the reasons why they needed electors then. The question is, do we need them any less now than when we needed them then? Here's what points that he made. The sense of the people should operate in the choice. In other words, the people should be able to make a choice when it comes to the president. Not to any pre-established body like the Senate, the House, anybody like that, but to men chosen by the people for the special purpose. In other words, they're chosen to be electors. That's their only job. That's the only thing they go for, is they go to sit down and determine who has won the presidency for your particular state, and then they represent you. That's sent to the Congress and the House and the Senate in session together, opens those from each state. And then this past election, presidential election, people argued that there were House members that challenged the electors of certain states. And they acted like it's the first time that ever happened in our history. But the truth is that happens at every time the electors go up there. In fact, Joe Biden himself challenged, if I remember correctly, rose and challenged the electors from a particular state. So that happens all the time. You challenge them because you want to make sure they're legit, they're accurate, and they're what the people want. And you have to make sure that for instance, a state could just get together and hand-pick their number of electors and send them up there, and the people have nothing to do with it, and they don't know who's sent, and you can pick the ones that you want. So our state, whoever it goes for, is who the electors are supposed to go up there, who they're supposed to send the votes in for. They don't have to. There's no law, nothing in the Constitution that says they have to. So they could go up and say, we want the other one for president. Well, if you did, then you'd want somebody to challenge it, because you say, well, that's not the way our state went. Our state election went like this. So anyway, he said not to any pre-established body, but to men chosen by the people for the special purpose. It's their only purpose. That the immediate election should be made by men most capable of analyzing the qualities and adapted to the station. For instance, how well do you all personally know Joe Biden? How well do you personally know Donald Trump? How well do you know RFK Jr.? How well do you... We don't know any of these people. But just by what people say. But the thing about it is, one person, everyone who likes the person is going to say this about them. Who doesn't like them is going to say this about them. If you listen to the different... I try to get both sides of the news so I can get as close a centered view as I can of what a particular person stands for. But most of the time, in the general election, it's more of emotional choices than it is deciding on a particular party or a particular stand that they take on certain issues. So it has to do with emotions. So what he's doing is saying, we're going to appoint people that are closer to these organs of power, if you will, or these people in power, and know them and know their stance better than we do, and they can go up there and represent us. And that's the reason we have House and Senate members anyway. A small number of persons selected by their fellow citizens from the general mass will be most likely possess the information and discernment requisite to so complicated an investigation. And it's a complicated issue to determine which person should be president, which one is the most qualified, which one stands for what you stand for. All those things come to play, and we have to trust people. We have to trust somebody. Because anybody I've ever voted for president, I did not personally know them. I only knew what was said about them, what they said about themselves, what their past record was. That's the only thing I knew. I didn't know them good enough to know personally if that would be the best choice for president. I didn't know that, but there are people that do know, and we need to select those wisely. One of the inherent weaknesses in a government based on the will of the people is the potential for mob rule. And I'm going to show you, in fact, it says, This was often the downfall of direct democracies, where people decided on public matters directly rather than through representatives. Now, can you imagine if our nation of 340 some million people went to direct vote for president, for all major issues, if we voted on all those and made those decisions? What would it be like? So I want to show you something about people. This is, you probably can't see this, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, LBJ, Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Bush, Obama, and Trump. This is going to show you how much people's thinking of a person changes over the course of their presidency. Look at Harry Truman. His highest, I'll tell you, the highest job approval rating of any president in history was George H.W. Bush. His was up like 90-some%, or right at 90%, at one time during his. Now think about this now. This shows you how fickle human beings are and how fickle American citizens are. He went from a 90% approval rating to losing the election within 2 years. Okay, look at Truman. He was up there at well over 80%, but his rating was as low as 20-some%, his approval rating during his presidency. You think much changed about what he did to make it change that much? Look at the next one, Eisenhower. He was up about 80%, but he got down to as low as in the 30s. And then you come on down and you look at the different. Nixon was up about 70%, but he got down to, you notice he didn't get as low as what Truman did? Even with all that went on with him. You look at Reagan here. Well, look at Carter first, because he's the next one too. He was up about 75% and down to as low as about 30%. And Reagan never got as high as him, but he got close to 70%, but he never went as low as him. He got about down to about 35, 38%. If you elect presidents on what people think of a job approval rating, how in the world do you know? What I'm getting at is people are fickle. Emotions can change things, and I can have a president that emotionally I don't care for, or presidential candidate that emotionally I don't care for, but I sit down and look at what have they done, what's their record, what do they stand for, what are they promoting, and then I can decide whether I might not like the person. We've had people I've voted for president that I didn't like the person's personality at all, but I voted for them for particular reasons. You get on down here and you see that Donald Trump never got to 50%. He got about 48% was his highest approval rating in office, but he never got as low as George W. did. He never got as low as Truman did, or many of these. You get Kennedy here was up to almost, how many years was he in office? What year did he take office? 1961, January 20th, 1961. And he died November the 22nd, 1963. He didn't even serve a full term, but his job approval rating was over 80% and never got down any lower than about just less than 70%. Do you think that was because of his policies, of what he did, of what he promoted, or you think it's because of emotions and people thinking with their feelings more so than they're thinking with their head and thinking with what's best? None of them knew him. Get on from that. This paper also discusses the provisions for the House of Representatives. What this is saying, you can read it if you want to. If the electors cannot come up with a candidate, it's a tie. There's no way they can determine for sure. The House of Representatives can step in and go through a series of votes and determine who the next president is. in the Constitution, Article 2, Section 1, in every case, this is out of the Constitution itself, in every case after the choice of the president, the person having the greatest number of votes of the electors shall be the vice president. So how does this say you're electing president and vice president? Okay. How do they decide who's the president? Is the one with the most electoral votes. How do they decide who's the vice president? One with the second most. Is that the way we do now? No. That changed. It changed with the 12th Amendment in 1804 because it didn't, the amendment was proposed after the 1796 election resulted in President John Adams and Vice President Thomas Jefferson from opposing parties. That didn't work out very well. They were good friends and then they weren't. And they got to be bitter rivals at one particular point. And then in 1800, Jefferson and Aaron Burr were a tie. So which one's president? Which one's vice president? They're both from the same party, and it took 36 ballots before they could break the tie and determine that Thomas Jefferson was going to be the president. Came that close to Aaron Burr being the president instead of Thomas Jefferson. Aaron Burr, if you don't know, Hamilton is one that wrote most of these. He's the one that killed Hamilton in a duel. So he was a...
Back then, the men just ran for office, and the highest one got the presidency, and the next one got the vice presidency.
If 8 men ran for president, the top vote getter is president, second one is vice president.
Wow, I didn't realize that.
Yes, that's the way you can see why that would be.
I can see why it would work if it was opposite.
Yeah, and you have somebody from each. That's
How would they get anything done?
it's hard to get. Well, I can tell you what happened with Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who became his Secretary of State, did not like Aaron Burr. Well, Aaron Burr was vice president, and the only assigned official duty for the vice president is he is the chairman of the Senate. So he oversees the Senate. Well, Thomas Jefferson, and he just kind of pushed him out to the side and didn't ask his opinion on anything, didn't have anything to do with him whatsoever. So he was really ineffectual completely. It didn't work out well. But now, what's the job of a vice president now? If you had to say what it was, what's the vice president's job? He breaks the tie in the Senate because he's the chairman. It would say the chairman of the Senate. He's the one that. But what else is his job? Well, he can go to funerals. He can go to things, whatever the president. His job is to do whatever the president tells him to do. Does the bidding of the president. Where I think Mike Pence and Donald Trump were two total different personalities. Mike Pence, I thought, did a great job because he supported Donald Trump as he should have as vice president, even when he didn't agree with him and didn't agree with a lot of things he said. So that's what you kind of have to do because you're the vice president. You're not the president. You really have no assigned duties except what the president assigns to you, except being the head of the Senate. So anyway, they changed that, which was good. So why is the Electoral College bad? What's bad about the Electoral College? Because he's defending it here. What's something that's... Right. It can. You elect like Donald Trump became president and didn't have the most popular votes. He didn't have the most amount of the votes, but he became president. Is that right or wrong? That's a disadvantage of it. But why is the Electoral College a good thing? What's good about the Electoral College? Diana mentioned something. PragerU has a 5-minute video on Electoral College. if we got the internet out here, I would have played it for you all, because in that 5 minutes, they do the best job of explaining the Electoral College. When you think, PragerU, it's short for Prager University. It's not really a university. It's but they come up with little short 5-minute videos to tell you about different things, from Electoral College to slavery to founding our nation. There's a lot of things that's there that they cover them in little 5-minute, 6-minute sessions, so that you can get a general idea of and a lot of times you understand better than what you can understand from the textbooks. But anyway, the Electoral College, what's good about the Electoral College, as far as I'm concerned, is, and what he's arguing, if you had just popular vote only, any man or woman that wanted to be president could go to the major cities in the United States and convince them to vote for him, and never go to any state, never go to any place, never come to North Carolina, never go to Utah, never go to any place in all these, Missouri, all these states, Montana, Wyoming. He wouldn't have to campaign in any of those, because all he has to do is get so many million votes and he wins. Well, is that the will of the people? The will of North Carolina is what the popular vote is in North Carolina. That's the will of the people. Our electors are supposed to vote accordingly, so our state gets that much of a vote. California, let's see, North Carolina, can't remember the populations, but the population of California is like 4 or 5 times the size of North Carolina. So they could outvote us all day. In fact, don't hold me to this, but I think this is correct. When Donald Trump ran against Hillary Clinton, he was ahead in the popular vote until California was counted. So if they hadn't counted California, he'd have won the popular vote anyway. But he didn't, but because he had all the rest of these electoral votes, because he'd won all these little states, then he won the presidency. But that one state would have made her president of the United States instead of Donald Trump. So that's what I like about the Electoral College. Not because it was Trump and it was Clinton, but because there's any two candidates. I'd rather California not decide our elections every year. Who's president, regardless of how they are. So, one of the inherent weaknesses in a government based on the will of the people is the potential for mob rule. That's one thing that he said, because if you have the will of the people, just all you have to do is look at the American Revolution and the French Revolution. American Revolution created a government, got into power, then in 1787 drew up a constitution to do away with the Articles of Confederation and establish a government that's been standing ever since then. France, the French Revolution, you had the mobs that came in and they started guillotining people, and they did the king and the queen and all different kind of people, and the original people that started that movement wound up being guillotined themselves by the people that came in after them. And what finally happened was Napoleon comes in and it becomes a dictatorship again. And he rules by his will. And so they have to go through the whole process, because they were more of a direct democracy of the people decide. Well, mobs of people can be pushed one way or the other. So that's what they're trying to keep from having mob rule. The college was essentially an extra layer of security, helping to guarantee that the president would be a truly capable individual. Has that happened every time? No. Which one of our presidents, 45 now? It's 45, 46, which is it? 45. I think it's 45. Out of all of them, which one was perfect? If we have 45 more, how many of them will be perfect? If we have 45 more and they're all women, how many will be perfect? None. It doesn't matter if they're human beings, they're not going to be perfect. boils down to that. The Electoral College allows each individual state to have a greater impact on selecting the president. So every state has more of a say now because of the Electoral College, that they have to fight for those votes in those states that they'd rather not go to in order to be able to win the presidency. Federalist 69, Hamilton seeks to counter claims that the president would be an elective monarch, as the anti-federalists claim. So what people were saying, the anti-federalists were saying, you elect one man president and he can become king. He can be proclaimed king and be just like Europe. But Hamilton points to the fact that the president is elected, whereas the King of England inherits his position. The king of, how did Charles become the King of England? His mama was the queen, and he was the next in line to the throne. When he dies, who becomes king? His oldest son, William, becomes king. So there's a succession, and it still is to this day. The president, furthermore, was only a qualified negative on legislative acts, i.e. veto, can be overturned, whereas the king has an absolute negative. In other words, if a law passes, the king refuses to sign it, it can't become law. Where with the president, he can veto a bill and they can override it with a two-thirds majority vote. So they can override his veto and put the law in place anyway. That happened here in North Carolina when Roy Cooper vetoed a bill just a little while back, and the House and the Senate overrode his veto, and it became law anyway. That's so a king, a governor, whomever cannot have absolute power, because they have the power of, he can veto, but they can override his veto, where a king can't. Both the president and the king serve as commander-in-chief, but the king also has the power to raise and maintain armies, a power reserved for the legislature in America. In other words, President Biden can't come out next week and decree, I'm going to raise another 2 million troops. That's not his choice. That's up to the legislature. They have to determine what they can do and what they can't do so far as raising an army. He can't raise his own. What's the problem with Joe Biden or Donald Trump or whoever being able to raise armies as a president? If they could raise an army themselves, then they could overthrow everybody else and become a king. They could become a ruler. They'd have too much power. The president can only make treaties with the approval of the Senate. The king can make binding treaties as he sees fit. In other words, the king can make a treaty with another country, the King of England could, and it didn't matter what the parliament thinks. The treaty's made. But with the president, he can go and say, this is the treaty we want to make with you, and if the Senate doesn't approve of it, guess what? It doesn't go through. So he said they don't have the same kind of control. The president can only appoint officers with the approval of the Senate. In other words, they go through the nominating process. They nominate somebody for each cabinet position, each position in government, and then the Senate has to approve them, where the king, he can appoint whoever he wants to. The power of the presidency in terms of commerce and currency are severely limited, whereas the king is in several respects the arbiter of commerce. In other words, he can decide who you trade with, who you don't trade with, who you do business with, who you don't. He can make a lot of those decisions. Now, the king in England now and the queen before him have a whole lot less power than what the king of this day did, but a lot of it is just because they agree to it, not so much because they don't have it. Hamilton furthermore suggests that, in many respects, the president would have less powers over his constituents than the governor of New York has over his. Now, why did Hamilton mention that? Why would he mention the governor of New York? Who are the Federalist papers written to? Where were they published? They were published in the newspaper in New York under the name Publius, because he and Madison and Jay were trying to convince the people of New York to ratify the Constitution. So he says, look, this is roughly his argument. You have a governor in your state right now, and this governor is under a constitution that's very similar to the one we have. and you don't have any problem with that, so why do you have a problem with this for the president? Pretty good argument. So, who was to be the authority over Israel according to the Mosaic law? Who was to rule over Israel according to the law? The Mosaic law begins with the Ten Commandments, which prohibit idolatry or pantheism. Pantheism is many gods. Demand the honoring of one omnipotent, omniscient Creator God alone, require man's obedience to Him, and elevate his conduct towards his fellow man into a moral code. The law also established rules which govern the relation between religion and state and the duties and obligations of one another. So what's he saying? He's saying the ruler over Israel is the law. The ruler over Israel is God. How does God rule over His people? Through His law. So they're ruled by the law. At that time, they didn't have a king, remember. And here's a question for tonight, and this is where I wanted to get to. What did Moses say about the king, a king for his people? Now think about this now. There was not a king in Israel for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years after Moses wrote down the law. So the question is, what did Moses say? Why would he say anything about a king when there wasn't any king in the foreseeable future? And how would this help us in our president? Would follow if our presidents would follow this. Okay, here is what Moses was given standards for a king 1,000 years before a king ever existed in Israel. And it's in Deuteronomy, the 17th chapter. It starts with the 14th verse. When you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, and have taken possession of it and settled in it, and you say, let us set a king over us like all the nations around us. Isn't that what happened? Isn't that what they said? God kind of knew that before it took place. It's interesting if we'll listen to God to keep us out of trouble. 15th verse. Be sure to appoint over you a king the Lord your God chooses. He must be from among your fellow Israelites. Do not place a foreigner over you, one who is not an Israelite. The king, moreover, must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself, or make the people return to Egypt to get more of them. For the Lord has told you, you are not to go back that way again. He must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. He must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. Now listen to all he's saying here. When he takes the throne of his kingdom, listen to this. What he's saying here. When he takes the throne of his kingdom, he is to write for himself on a scroll a copy of this law, taken from that of the Levitical priests. It is to be with him, and he is to read it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to revere the Lord his God and follow carefully all the words of this law and these decrees, and not consider himself better than his fellow Israelites, and turn from the law to the right or to the left. Then he and his descendants will reign a long time over his kingdom in Israel. What thing, and I'm going to break them down now, what he says and what is established for the king. And I want you to look at these in the light of a president of the United States. Appoint over you a king, the Lord your God chooses. Wouldn't that be a good idea for us to have a president that God chose? How would we do that in our type of government? How would we do that? We pray and find out what God's will is, and then we go vote according to what God's will. If all of God's children in the United States would do that one thing before they go to the poll, we'd see a big difference. Anyway, one that God chooses. He must be from among your fellow citizens. Do not place a foreigner over you, one who is not of your nation, because they don't see things from other places the same way that we do. The king, moreover, must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself. He must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. Now let me clarify this a little bit and give you an example, and I'm not trying to beat up on somebody. John F. Kennedy, there were many things that he supported and policies that he wanted instituted that I agree with. I won't say that. I started to say something that I might regret, so I won't say that. But so there's a lot of things that he did, that he implemented, that he supported, that he pushed for, that I agree. You know, one of the things he said that we needed to do in 1960 when he was campaigning, and he went about doing in 1961 when he took office, was to lower the income tax. That doesn't sound like something that a Democrat of today would do, but it sounded like something that a Republican would do. It was a different thing, but I agree with a lot he did. How many wives did he have? How many affairs did he have while he was in office? Do you think that could have compromised him in some way? And now you can. Some of this is conjecture, some of it's not. Some of this is based on fact, but I won't get into all that. Most of you heard that he had an affair with Marilyn Monroe, right? He started distancing himself from her towards the end of her life and his life. He started distancing himself from her because he saw that a high-profile woman like this could pull him down. What if she started, if you have a president of the United States who's married like he was, I'm not just beating up on him, he's not the only one that's had affairs, but if he's having affairs with 4 or 5 different women, what is he telling these women? What if one of them says, look, you do this or I'm going to tell on you. I'm going to turn you in. It could compromise him, couldn't it? It's the same thing here it's the same idea and the same concept of what we're talking about here. If this man is having affairs with, that's like having other wives, really, except you don't support them in the same way, but sometimes under the table. But this particular case, not have many wives because it could turn your heart from God. He must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. Must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. Why is that important? Because that could turn his attention from... When Ronald Reagan, and I looked this up just to help you out. When Ronald Reagan took office, he listed his net worth at $4 million. When he died, his net worth was like $13 million. Okay. When Bill Clinton took office, his net worth was like $2 million. Today is $250 million. Well, what I'm getting at is, now he did not do that while he was in the presidency. Neither did Ronald Reagan. They earned that after they left the presidency. What if they started accumulating that money while they were in office, and that's what they had in mind more than anything? What if Bill Clinton, which I don't know him, I personally don't know anything about him except what I've read and what I've seen occur. What if what he had in his mind the whole time he was president was, look, I'm going to make a big payday off of this thing. And a lot of times people will go into public office knowing that I'm going to use this as leverage to make money. And they do that at the Senate level, the House level, the president. I mean, it's almost better in some cases for a president of the United States to be worth $500 million when he gets elected. There's less chance that he's going to be in it for the money. Now, that's just, it doesn't mean it is, but I'm saying you can look at it for the wrong reasons. You can get it. Who was the poorest of our presidents when he took office? Who had the lowest net worth of any of our presidents? George Washington was the wealthiest. but not in money. He had to borrow money just to get to Washington, but he had thousands and thousands and thousands of acres of land. He owned land all over everywhere. So his worth was in land. So he was the wealthiest president, but it was in land. So who was the least wealthy? I got to get through. Truman. Truman was the poorest man when he would. Pardon me? Yeah, he was more of the common man. He was the last president of the United States that did not graduate from college. Was Truman. He must not accumulate large. Pardon me? Well, the thing with this is just not doing with this. Biden's age would preclude him from accumulating much after he leaves office unless he lived to be 150, which I don't know many people that do. So, I mean, from that angle, there's not much he has to lose in that or win. When he takes the throne of his kingdom, this is the part I like. What if a president did this? When he takes the throne of his kingdom, he is to write for himself on a scroll a copy of this law. It didn't say he's supposed to get a copy. What does it say? He's supposed to write it. He's supposed to sit down and write this law out. Now, what's he supposed to do with it? This copy of the law is to be with him, and he is to read it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to revere the Lord his God and follow carefully all the words of this law and these decrees. What if every president of the United States had to sit down and copy out the Constitution with its amendments, and then, on top of that, take it and read it and study it the whole time he's in office? Would the president, I don't care if he's Republican, Democrat, what he is, it would be a different situation.
Sounds like a good idea.
It's a great idea. He's not to consider himself better than his fellow citizens and turn from the law to do right or to go right or to go left. He's not any better than anybody else. In our form of government, the president is not a ruler over us. Neither is the Senate, neither is the House. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed with their Creator with certain inalienable rights.
Well, if they did the law thing and followed God, we wouldn't have anybody to do.
No, you wouldn't have to worry if they followed. If they didn't follow, if the President of the United States did not follow the Bible, but he stuck strictly to the Constitution. The Constitution is a lot shorter than the Bible. Or the Mosaic Law. Wouldn't take near as much time. But they don't care what it says. And I will wrap it up with that. The 70th and the 71st, all the way through 72, 73, 74, 75, 76, 77. All of those have to do with the presidency. Every one of them have to do with the presidency, and we could go on and belabor the point more and more. But he uses all of those from where he started all the way through from what was 68 all through 70, all the way through 77. Talks about the presidency and argues for the presidency as established by the Constitution. So you have any questions?